In my younger, more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. I understand that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For an intimate revelation of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are unusually plagiaristic and unmarred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that. As my father snobbishly suggested, I snobbishly repeat, a sense of fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or on wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at sort of moral tension forever. I wanted no more righteous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wakes of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elections of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition in that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, who sent a substitute to the Civil War and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later, I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I suppose it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year. After various delays, I came east permanently. I thought in the spring of 22, the practical way was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and the practical way was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season. I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man of the office suggested that we take a house together in commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found a house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed, cooked breakfast, and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived. Then I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him that as soon as I walked, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood, and so with the sunshine and the great burst of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down at as a young breath giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities. They stood on the shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas, Morgan, and Messias knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is so much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, righteous island, which extends itself due to east of New York, where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by Courtesy Bay, just out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They're both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblances must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls that fly over the head. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their dissimilarity. In every particular way, except shape and size, I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two. Though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them, my house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 and $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, which, with a tower on one side spanking new under a new thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a man of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and a consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and a history of summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with Tom Buchanan's. Daisy was my second cousin once removed. I had known Tom in college just after the war. I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football in New Haven, a national figure in a way. One of those men who reach such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter of reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they come east, I don't know. They spent a year in France for no particular reason, then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened on a warm, windy evening. I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends who I scarcely knew each other. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile. Jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens, it reached the house, drifting up to the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a surreptitious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of the body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see the great pack of muscles shifting over his shoulder under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked, and they were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, but it's because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We are in the same senior society. While we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to be like him, with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restfully, turning around by one arm. He moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in his sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motor boat that bumped to the side to tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around, again politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blue curtains at one end and out the other, like pale flags, twisting up towards the frosted wedding cake of a ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow of it, and wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had been blown back in and after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and caught wind died out about the room. The curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it, which was likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her in coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with an unconscious expression, and she laughed an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness, she laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up to my face, promising there was no one in the world she was so much wanted to see. That was the way she had. She hinted in a murmur, and the surname of a balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that an ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lonely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and bright, passionate mouth. There but there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A seething convulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I had stopped off into Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as the mourning wreath, and there is a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom. Tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restfully about the room, stopped and rested his hand on the shoulder. What are you doing, Nick? I'm a bond man. Who with? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked. Decisively, this annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East. Don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back to me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into a room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on the sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How do you get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted woman with a direct carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-stained eyes looked at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single... You must know Gatsby. Gatsby, demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could reply, he was my neighbor. Dinner was announced, wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine. Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languishingly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out the rosy-colored porch, open towards the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day in the year. She looked at us all radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year, then miss it? I always watch for the longest day in the year, then miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the tables as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What'll we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did it. Do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great, big, hulking, physical specimen. I hate that word, hulking, objected Tom, crossing, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Hulking. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, with a banter in consequence that was never quite chatter. That was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making any polite, pleasant toward effort to entertain or be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening, too, would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel civilized, Davy. I confessed on my second glass of corky, but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken as an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Well, I know, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is that we don't look out for the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy, with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word? Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously towards the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and you are. And after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at him again. And we've all produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency were more acute of an old was not enough to him anymore. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruptions and leaned towards me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be a silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night, until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Daisy. Yes, things went from bad to worse, until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, that little sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then glow faded, each light deserting her lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and conceding. I'd love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he? He turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose. This was untrue. I'm not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warm flower from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up and alertly and said, "Shh," in a warming voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward unashamed. Try to hear. The murmur trembled upon the verge of coherence and sank down and mounted excitedly, then ceased together. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor, I began. Don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly suggested. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman, I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I gasped her meaning, there was a flutter of a dress and a crutch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back on the table. It couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued, I looked outdoors for a minute. It was very romantic outdoors. There was a bird on the lawn, and it must be a nightingale come over the Cunard or White Star Line. He's singing away, her voice sang, It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, he said, and then miserably to me, If it's a light enough after dinner, I want you to take you down to the stables. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom. The subject of the stables, in fact, all subjects, vanished in the air, among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at dinner at table. I remembered the candles being lit again. Pointlessly, I was conscious and wanting to look squarely at the everyone, and yet, to avoid all eyes, I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking. But I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able to utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill, metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back in the library as if to a vigil besides a perfectly tangible white, while trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf. I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker set. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly. "Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true," she hesitated. "Well, I've had a very hard time, Nick, and I'm very cynical about everything." Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh, yes," she looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how much I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less of an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head and wept. 'All right,' I said. 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl could be in this world, a beautiful fool. You see, I think everything's terrible. Anyhow,' she went on in a convinced way, 'everybody thinks so. The most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything.' Her eyes flashed her in a defiant way. Rather like Tom, she laughed with a thrilling scorn. 'Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated.' The instant her voice broke off and ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contrary emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light, and Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words murmuring and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. "Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow," explained Daisy at Westchester. "Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew why her face was familiar. It's a pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotograph pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some stories of her too, a critical, unpleasant story. What it was I had forgotten long ago. 'Good night,' she said softly. 'Wake me at 8, won't you, if you'll get up?' 'I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway,' she said anew. 'Of course you will,' confirmed Daisy. 'In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick. I'll sort of fling you together. You know, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing.' 'Good night,' called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word." "She's a nice girl," said Tom after a moment. "They ought to let her run around the country this way." "Who ought to?" inquired Daisy coldly. "Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her." Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. "Is she from New York?" I asked quickly. "From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white." "Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talked on the veranda?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Did I?" She looked at me. "I can't seem to remember, but I think we've talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure that we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know. Don't you believe everything you hear, Nick?" I said lightly I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up home. They came to the floor with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peroratively called, "Wait. I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west." "That's right," corroborated Tom. "Kindly, we heard that you were engaged." "It's a libel. I'm too poor." "But we heard it," insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. "We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true." Of course, I knew that they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors. And on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored in a marriage. Their interest rather touched me and made me less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the only thing for Daisy to do was rush out of the house, child in arms, but apparently there was no such intention in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than that he had been depressed by a book. Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism was no longer nourished in his preparatory heart. Already it was deep summer on road house roofs, and in front of the wayside garage, where new red petrol pumps sat out in pools of light, and I reached my estate at West Egg. I ran the car under its shed, sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw as I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver prepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would be due for an introduction, but I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of the dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in unquiet darkness.